Click the record button. We're gonna get started for today. An interesting question was brought up. Unionization in the games industry is an important subject that we'll probably touch upon a little bit during the economics lecture for game design. Uh, I'm opening up the syllabus for game design or this class right now. Yeah, we have a little bit of time to probably talk about it during economics, but we'll talk about it a little bit today because we're talking about game development teams today. And today is a very important subject for all of you because for many of you, this class works as sort of a supplement to the course on game design, right? I've kind of, because I've been teaching them back to back or basically together this entire, since I've worked at COD, I have kind of designed them to work as complements of one another. Well, this is an introductory class, so I also designed it so that it's, if you're not interested in game design as a course and you're just interested in learning a little bit more about the video game industry, you can do that as well. But if you're taking my development class, this does work as a supplement to that class because we talk about subjects in this course that we don't talk about and we can't talk about very much in my design course. Obviously, the design course is focused on game design. We're not going to talk about engineering or production or art or anything like that over the course of that. But here, we get the opportunity to do so. I was just asked about unionization, which is why we're sort of like starting, screaming hot and heavy right in the beginning of this class recording, which I'm just going to double check to make sure it is actually recording. We're good to go. Unionization is an important thing for everybody, right? If you look at literally every other art form, I mean, like literally every single one, music industry, film industry, stagecraft, all of that, they all have unions and they're very powerful unions. And notice, if you will, that the film industry generally has very high paid people who work in it, and it's an artist driven industry rather than a studio driven industry, right? Nobody gives a shit if Touchstone is making a new movie. They give a shit if like Martin Scorsese is making a new movie, or if Chris Pratt's going to be in a new movie, or whatever, right? And this is a subject I've talked about this on my stream a lot, but in the video game industry, we used to have what was called the rockstar game industry, right? At least that's what I've called it because it's the best way to describe it, right? This is the industry where you had people who made video games whose names you knew, right? People like Hideo Kojima or Shigeru Miyamoto or Cliff Bleszinski or Ed Boon, exactly. Thank you, Daniel. People whose names you knew, and if they were making a game, you had sort of an expectation of like what they were going to be making. Yeah, Warren Spector. There's a lot. Like we can look up like famous game designers. Sid Meier, very big one. John Romero, very big. Daniela Butenberry, very, very big. Tim Schafer. People whose names, like, if you said them and said that they were making a game, that it was really, really likely that you kind of had an idea of, like, what you were getting out of the product, right? Jonathan Blow is a big one. There's Richard Garfield. There's Yuji Horii. There's Gabe Newell, obviously. There's Alexei Pajitnov. Gary Gygax, big one. The list goes on, obviously, right? The reason that you knew names, Todd Howard's a very big one. The reason that you knew these names is because back in the the 80s and early 90s, we were a creator-driven industry, right? Our industry was based on who made the game was just as important as the game itself, right? And this this is a very important concept because at the time, game designers and game developers commanded a lot of respect in the industry. If you were a John Romero or a Ed Boon and you said that you wanted to make a new game, you'd have people flocking to you to give you millions of dollars because they knew they were going to get a lot out of you, right? That changed. Ironically, that entire concept started out with Activision. Activision was actually the originator of the Rockstar game developer. When they first hit the scene in the early '80s, it was a reaction to Nintendo. Nintendo forbid their game designers from putting their name on the work. It was a Nintendo product. It wasn't a product of a Shigeru Miyamoto or Kenji Inafune or anything like that, right? It was a Nintendo game. Activision hated that. They hated the concept that they would put in all this work and all this effort, and then their name wouldn't get put onto the game. And so Activision was actually the one that sat down and said that when you make a game at Activision, your name, it's like golf presented by person who designed the game, right? Ironically, it is Activision's fault that we no longer have the Rockstar game industry. Because Activision, the company, went through a restructuring back in 95, 96, I think, somewhere in there. And they actually banned people from putting their names on the games and instead wanted to have the Activision name be the principal thing about the game. This is very important because as developers and as makers of games, right, our industry has become commoditized, right? We're now no longer about art, and we're no longer about creating good products. We're now about creating money, right? Commodity goods and product service announcements and all of that kind of stuff are all in service of bigger and bigger and bigger products, which sell bigger and bigger and bigger amounts, which lead to bigger and bigger and bigger paydays for executives and advertisers and everybody in between, right? It used to be that you made a game because the person who was making the game wanted to make a game, and then making a bucket of money was just kind of a bonus, right? Obviously, it was also part of the goal. It's your job, right? But it used to be that when you made a game, the person who was making it had an expectation that they were going to be the ones making a bucket of money, right? Hideo Kojima gets paid. I think he has a $50 million salary every time he makes a game because it's a Hideo Kojima game. People are buying it because his name is attached to it. Death Stranding is like a weird fucking game, but people bought it because Hideo Kojima's name was attached to it. Same thing with PT. Same thing with most of the Metal Gear games, right? Now, don't get me wrong, the Metal Gear franchise is very popular, right? But just as you wouldn't buy a Metal Gear, or you wouldn't watch The Godfather if it wasn't filmed by Scorsese, you wouldn't bother to buy Metal Gear if Kojima wasn't attached to it, which we saw with Metal Gear Survive, right? That proved that Kojima's the one kind of bringing people in, right? Coppola, sorry. Francis Scott Coppola. My bad. Thank you very much, Kieran. Suffice it to say that there is an expectation attached to these names, right? Unionizing in the games industry is the only way for our industry to escape the hellscape that it has become for people working in studios, right? Working in studio is difficult. It's taxing. There's extremely egregious hours. There's expectations of profit margins, all this kind of stuff. That the geniuses of the industry aren't perfect, though. Hideo Kojima and Death Stranding, while Scorsese had Jack. I mean, Death Stranding's a good game, and I mean, yeah, Scorsese had Jack, but we don't have to talk about Jack. But even that, like, when you look at games that are built by studio executives, right? That's where you start getting films like Jack and Jill, or you start getting movies like like the 30 billion rom-coms in the 90s, right? Where they're soulless. Yeah, I'm sure that they sold well, right? I'm sure that they work fine, but they don't have any of like the real meat, right? They don't have any of the real heart of the industry at their core, right? And those movies are definitely movies that are made by a film studio, right? If we look at like blockbuster films that are like kind of hot trash, like, I don't know, let's look at blockbuster films. If you kind of take a look at that, you got like whatever the fuck, Iron Edge of Tomorrow is like totally a studio film, right? Like Pacific Rim is a studio film. The new Independence Day is a studio film. Like these are all movies that like yeah, like they exist, right? But like, does anybody really care, right? And that's really like the what we're talking about here today. Um, but the biggest factor, more than anything, is that the erasure of the people who make it as like factors in like why they're relevant is really saddening, and it points towards a huge problem in the industry at large, and just a big problem in general with like the way that we approach making games. That the person who makes it, the person whose brainchild it is, the people who pour their blood, sweat, and tears into it, um, nobody knows their names, right? You're irrelevant. You're just a cog in a machine, right? It's the studio at large, so like Raven and all of them that get the credit, which is fair, and I actually think that that is fair, right? But there are definitely games who they're made by specific people. Even getting away from that, even getting away from the sort of Rockstar agreement, where I think that some people deserve more credit than they get. Um, People who work in AAA studio environments have an expectation put onto them that they are going to basically work until they die, and that isn't healthy for anybody, right? You have an expectation that you're going to be doing overtime. That it's not you're not maybe gonna do you're gonna be doing overtime, but you're a salaried employee, so you don't receive any special benefits for going overtime or doing crunch. Most studio people don't actually have the option to take a pay cut in order to gain profit margin on the game itself. Um, there's a lot of different problems that our industry faces that people talk about regularly: crunch time, abusive behavior in the industry, unionization for protection of employee rights. The ability to be fired and then be blackballed by the industry is a real thing that does happen in the games industry. All of that, and I think that a union helps alleviate a lot of those problems, particularly the crunch time effect. Crunch occurs. Crunch is it's going to happen. Unfortunately, it's just part of the way that the industry works. The timelines and the amount of money on the line and everything else, you're going to have some crunch. But some studios work by crunch. Like the crunch is the norm, not the exception, and that's unacceptable, right? And then you get studios like, um, oh my god, Telltale Games. Uh, Telltale Games had a studio culture where if you weren't willing to crunch and if you couldn't do crunch time, they would scorn you in the workplace. It would become a hostile work environment. This eventually led to their downfall. It's why they don't exist anymore. But they had huge problems, and then those people got fired, and a lot of them were left aimless in the industry. They didn't have somewhere to go. A union would help out with that as well, right? It would help out with things like the constant churn in most studios, where if you aren't somebody who's like a senior team exec, your contract lasts a couple of years, and then they let you go, and then you have to go find a new place to live and a new place to work and a bunch of other shit. It's why all the game developers live in California. Because then if your contract ends at, say, Activision, you can go work at EA or Blizzard or Bethesda or ZeniMax or whatever, right? Like there's 1,000 studios, so you don't need to move. A lot of the time, especially for independents and especially for smaller AA studios, when your contract ends, they just say, okay, bye, and then you have to go. And depending on the kind of role that you're in, that can happen a lot. I know, especially for QA personnel, it happens all the time where they're constantly moving all over the country, multinationally, just like they pick up contracts, they live somewhere for 2 years, and then they move. And it's a difficult lifestyle, and things like unions would help out with that, right? Um, yeah. Also related, is this why smaller studios like Supergiant and No Code are made up of people who used to be big AAA work cycles? Yeah. A lot of AAA people fall downward into AA or independent development because the AAA work style actually like breaks their back. Like it's highly demanding. It's very challenging. It's taxing on you mentally, physically, and creatively. And so a lot of the people end up leaving the AAA scene to start their own outfits because it's better that way. It's a lot simpler. You're able to give yourself more freedom, and it's a problem. And it's a problem for not just the people who like are working, but obviously for everybody. So it's something that I think our industry really needs to get on top of. I think it's something that I'm a big proponent of unionizing. I think it would also ease the entry into the games industry because then you would join the game industry union and then they would put you somewhere, right? Because that's how regular unions work, right? Is if you join a union, they will find you a place for you to work, right? They want you to be part of the industry because you're paying dues, and so they want to put you in places. And so I think that it would make it easier for people to get into the industry. It would help cut down a little bit on like the sort of flood of like shovelware shit, because then you could have like games that were made using like union labor, which you kind of like would be able to know, and so then you would be able to like point towards things that are like maybe abusive studios that used non-union game developers and sort of be like, they didn't use union game developers, so they must have like had abusive practices, and it'll be easier to do that kind of stuff. And don't get me wrong, there's obviously abuses can occur, and we see that a lot in things like the construction industry and all of that, but I think the benefits outweigh the potential problems. So keep that in mind. All right, everybody should be in the Discord stream, and we're gonna go ahead and get started on that note with the game development team. So today we're gonna be covering the various like jobs and areas of possible work and labor that you can actually do in the games industry. The game development team is very, very broad. There's a lot of different sections of a game studio that you can actually work. There's a lot of different jobs. If any of you have actually been on Grackle HQ at all, you'll know that there's a lot. I mean a lot of jobs, and I'll go ahead and repost Grackle down here for all of you. GrackleHQ.com. Great website for job hunting if you are looking for internships. Again, there's a lot of internships up right now. Highly recommend taking a look at those. You should definitely be trying to get internships basically all the time. And if you're not constantly trying to get internships, I will tell you right now, that is how you end up in my position, where I have multiple published titles under my belt, including a AAA title, and I can't get into a studio. It sucks. Don't do that. Get some internships. Use your summers wisely. If you're not going to if you cannot get an internship, spend your summer making like a small something. Make a small something over the summer. Pick up RPG Maker, or learn how to do some mild coding to make like a little mobile game or something, and kind of like develop it out that way or something to that effect. Because you really need to press yourself if you're going to try to get into one of these studios without getting some kind of internship. So keep that in mind. But the game development team, like I said, it's very broad. And if you've been on Grackle, you know that there is a lot of different areas of game development that you can really work in. And that doesn't even include things like marketing. It doesn't include things like, the secondary systems. Like if you're going to try to work at work as IT, you're going to work as like internal support technicians, you're going to work as like computer support or anything like that. There's a lot of ways to work in a game studio, all the way down to the game studios have janitors. I know that's not why you guys are here getting an associate's for, but I mean, our industry employs a lot of different people. Offices require a lot of moving hands and moving parts to kind of stay operational. So game dev teams are made up of a lot of different people with a lot of different skills. And a standard dev team will have 5 people in it from 5 major disciplines that separate out into specialties to tackle different tasks. When we talk about these kinds of jobs, we are talking about AAA and AA development. Independent development is a fucking crapshoot. You'll have people who do 7 jobs, and you'll have people that are both the designer and the producer and the accountant, and like wearing 7 different hats, and booping around and being like, I'm doing it all right now, blah blah blah, right? Um, all of this, none of this applies to independents, because the independents are the Wild West. Like, they don't follow any rules, right? But a big important thing to understand is that the terminology and the specialties vary from studio to studio, right? So you might work at like Raven, and Raven might have their level designer is only in charge of level geometry and not enemy placement, because they have a guy who's an encounter designer whose job it is to take the level geometry and then put stuff in it to make it interesting, right? You might work at Treyarch the next year, right, as a new contract, and they might have you as a level designer doing both encounter and level design. So you might be making the level and shaping the world, and then also populating it with stuff, right? So it kind of depends studio to studio, but this is a good general overview of like what you could be doing, right? So these are the 5 disciplines that I've narrowed down. There are other ones, like obviously community, IT. There's things like HR, public outreach, all of that kind of thing, all of that kind of stuff as well. But these are the 5 major disciplines as far as I'm concerned, and as far as my opinion goes. Right? There's design, which is why is it that way? Sort of like the what of the game. What is it? Why is it like that? Programming, how do we make it do that, or how is it that way? Art, what way is it looking, right? Production, when and where did it happen? And audio, the sometimes why, which is how does it sound, right? Each of these is critical in their own in particular way, right? Each one will tell you that they're the most important, right? Designers are very, very concerned with the fact that it's their brainchild, that they're the ones who came up with, the grappling hook mechanic, and they spent several months, designing it out and making sure it was just perfect. While a programmer will go, yeah, you did that, but then I had to put together the physics engine and the grapple point anchoring system and all of this other garbage. And then the artist will go, yeah, well, neither of those matter if nobody can see the damn thing. I'm the one that created the animation for the grappling hook mechanic and made it look pretty so that people actually give a shit. And production said, none of you would have a job if it weren't for my budgeting. And then our audio goes, yeah, but it sounds great. And then everyone goes, shut up, audio. And then they go, okay. And they hide back in their audio booth down in the basement where they belong. But all of these 5 disciplines are, again, important in their own way. Audio kind of gets the piss taken out of it, just because out of all the disciplines, audio and art sometimes get rolled together, and so sometimes audio isn't its own separate department and is instead part of the arts department. But it's always fun to kind of rib on the audio guys a little bit. They do a great job, and they're very important, and it is its own skill set, and it's one that I do not personally have. I don't have an ear for music or anything like that, but it is different. Music, composition and musical making, is part of the audio section. Generally, if your studio has its own dedicated musician, it has its own person who's making the soundtrack for it, you will probably have your own arts department. Otherwise, you'll outsource it from somebody else. Teasing the audio team is constant across industries. Hollywood is the same way. I mean, yeah, it is. It's pretty consistent from my experience, at least. Audio engineers are always the ones that are the butt of the joke, but the joke is that the joke's on us, because a lot of video games, especially with composers, the music that's in the game is 3 billion times more important than whether or not the rocks look proper or anything like that, So keep that in mind as well. Let's talk about design. So design is the sort of center point of the creative development team, right? If you kind of think about making a video game like a house, right? The design team are the architects of a house, right? The design team is the team that sits down and works out what exactly something is, right? So the best way to think about this is And if you're in my design class, you've already gotten some exposure to this, but this will be even a deeper dive into the concept. The design team are the ones that figure out what everything in the game actually is, right? So let's say you're making a 3D platformer, right? You want to make a Mario-esque 3D platformer, right? The design team is the one who figured out that a Mario-esque 3D platformer is what we want to be doing. They're the ones that did the market research. They're the ones that know what is selling right now. They're the ones that did all of the work and the legwork to come to the conclusion that making a Mario-esque 3D platformer is a good idea. Then they sat down and designed out what the character looks like, how high they can jump, how fast they can run, how big the areas are, how many levels are there, how does the combat work, who are the enemies, what do they look like, what are they capable of doing. And they sit down and they do all of this process, right? All of it. In a AAA studio, designers are broken up into subcategories and subdisciplines, right? You'll have level designers who are in charge of making in-engine areas. So they actually sit down in an engine like Unity or Unreal 4, Unreal 5, or, Frostbite or whatever. And they're actually using in-game, like, first they use in-game BSP, which is like the default geometry that comes with the engine. And then eventually the art team will either give them assets to put into the space manually, or the art team will be given a BSP space that is sort of like the framework for something like that. Like, let me see if I can find like a good photo of like a block out. Let me see if I can find like a good, yeah, there we go. That's a good one. So this is a block out, right? You can kind of see that there's not like there's no art, right? It's just like white blocks, white stuff. This is a better picture. This is a functional level, but it's ugly, right? It's ugly, but it works. Like, you could conceivably play the game in this space, right? It's functional. And this space will eventually get arted, and when it's arted, then it will be done, right? But this is a blockout. This is a what we call a white box. Level designers do this, right? Every level designer I know that's worth their salt starts with a blockout of some caliber, right? They sit down. First, they draw out the blockout on paper. They sort of like sit down and draw out the spaces, draw out like how it's going to look, how it's going to feel, what are the points of interest, where are the areas of conflict if it's a multiplayer game, all that kind of stuff. And then you'll eventually describe the art of the area to somebody, and then the artist will make art assets that then wrap around this blockout, and it'll look pretty and then look like a level from an actual video game, right? That's what a level designer does, right? A character designer then, conversely, is in charge of making the characters, right? They're the ones that write the characters, design out what their like motifs and style are, approve things like art direction for the character. They actually are the ones that would sit down, and if you were making like an RPG, they would design out the character's movement, their capabilities, like their abilities, their move sets, all of that kind of stuff, right? They also design out enemies generally. Generally, a character designer is also an enemy designer, right? They might be delineated depending on the volume of work in either direction. So like in an RPG, for instance, you might have a character design team and an enemy design team. And the two sort of coordinate with one another to make sure that there's proper power scaling, which is then, you go back and you balance everything out once everything's sort of been designed, etc., etc. Then you have system designers. System designers are the midpoint between engineering and design. System designer is the person that would create things like, how does a health system work? How does a point system work? How does a checkpoint system work? How does a hidden artifact level unlocking system work? That kind of stuff. If you are interested in engineering, but you're not interested in sort of like the deep-rooted engineering, you do want to end up working in engine a lot more. A system engineer is probably a good middle point, right? There's a lot of engineering requirements, but it's also like a creative, artistic adventure rather than like a pure mechanical, mathematical one. So there's that. There's UI UX design. These are the people that create the on-screen and in-game menus. They're also in charge of the overall experience of the game, right? So they translate things like damage into screen elements that help create like the emotion of the moment, right? So a UI designer, a UI UX designer is probably the person that figured out how to do like the blood vignetting in Call of Duty, right? That entire like system is probably built up by a UX UI designer working with a systems designer, right? They're also in charge of things like, you know, if you have the options menu, how that flows, whether or not it's readable, all of that. And then encounter design and level design go hand in hand. They sort of are like interlocked with one another. Sometimes your level designer will be your encounter designer. Sometimes the encounter designer is an independent person. An encounter designer uses the things that have been made by the engineers and by the design team to sort of craft what it is that you actually do in a moment, right? So your game director, your lead designer probably figured out that they want you to have an arena combat section in area 1A of level 1, right? So area 1A of level 1 is like this big circular like cage match dome that the level designers put together. And now your job as an encounter designer is to make a cage match arena combat scenario that's supposed to last a certain length of time and be a certain level of difficulty, right? And so you'll take the characters from the character design team, the enemies from the enemy design team, the systems, the UI UX, the level design, and the motifs, and put them all together into what eventually becomes, you know, Sharkosaurus's cage match, where you and Sharkosaurus have to fight each other inside of the Thunderdome while it slowly floods, and once it floods too much, Sharkosaurus will be able to swim, and then you'll be dead, right? So like that's an encounter, right? There's a lot more jobs in design, things that we didn't even talk about, like artistic design, audio design. You know, I've seen studios that have things all the way down to furniture design that are like you're designing like the actual furniture in the game, and then the art team is making it, that kind of thing. I've also seen things like QA design, all manner of bullshit that you can end up doing as a designer. There's a lot of it, and each one of them requires their own experience and their own expertise, and so it's worth trying to figure out like which one you really want to try to do, and then tunnel visioning in that direction if you're planning to work AAA. If you're not planning to work AAA, work on all of it because you're going to end up doing all of it. So there's that as well. Any questions about this? Awesome. All right. So basics of design. Design is the idea of taking parts and making something out of them, right? In games, it translates into a lot of different things. How should an enemy move and attack? What does the level look like? How many enemies are in that first and second encounter? What combinations of enemies are in level 1 versus level 2? You know, what ability does Yoshihiro unlock at level 5? What does Caitlyn's ultimate look like at level 6? You know, why do they get their ultimates at 6 or at 10? That kind of stuff, right? All of this falls under design, and they're extremely critical for game development, right? Designers are the people that people think about when they think about game development, right? You think about two kinds of people, engineers and designers, right? You're not really thinking about artists. You're not really thinking about producers, that kind of stuff, right? Designers are sort of, they're like the end point, right? They're your Hideo Kojimas, your Masahiro Sakurai's, your Cliff Blazinski's, your Ed Boon's, right? These are all designers. They're all very important. They sort of add their own voice and their own sort of like spirit to the things that they make, and it can go a long way. It's a difficult career to get into. There are very few designers per studio, but if you can become a designer, it's also one of the very few areas of game development that's very consistent. Most people, if they hire you as a designer, it's really likely that you'll continue to work at that studio as a designer for a very long time. So, you know, it can be a very consistent work field, right? Speaking of consistent, we got engineering. Engineering is the programming guts of the games industry, right? Obviously, if you are an engineer, you're you're doing pretty well, right? But if you are an engineer at heart, you know what the hell it is that I'm talking about here, right? We don't need to really like get too deep into like what an engineer does. Engineers create tools and the skeletons that make playing the game actually possible, right? They are the programming arm of the games industry. Without them, we wouldn't be able to actually render the game digitally in any conceivable way, and you would end up with basically just a bunch of ideas on a piece of paper. System engineers create the counting and timing systems inside of the game. They work very closely with the systems designers, and the two of them basically work together to make the core mechanics or the core systems of the game. So things like a life counter, a health counter, a spawning rig, a gate opening mechanics, boss and counter mechanics, all that kind of stuff. Event engineers are responsible for creating of event triggers and systems to make game moments occur. So these are the people that would actually take the spawning system and actually create triggering events that cause the spawning system to turn on, right? They're the ones that sort of build out the systems that make the systems that are built into the game work properly with something inside of the game itself, right? AI engineers are responsible for creating enemy control systems, and there's a lot more. Engineering is the area of game development that I am the weakest in, so I know the least about it. I just don't have any skill in engineering. I don't have like the brain for it, and so I know that there's a lot more to it, and there's a lot more like delineation. There's front end, back end developers. There's like all kinds. There's like system, or there's like engine back developers. There's like core system developers. There's a lot of different shit. Engineering is very important, and I feel like it is a little self-explanatory if you have any exposure to programming whatsoever, what it is that these people actually do and why it is that they're important, right? Programming is a skill, and you have to learn how to program. It's like learning a new language. A big part about programming is every single studio uses a different engine and a different language, right? Most of them are starting to standardize towards the C#, C++ back end. So if you learn C# and C++, you're likely to be in a very, very good space, because most studios' engines are now based on Unreal or based on like a framework that Unreal uses, right? Unreal and Unity are the two major, I guess the two major default engines, right? The two non-studio engines is the best way to put it. So if you learn C#, C++, you'll be able to work with either of them pretty easily. Both Unity and Unreal both have visual scripting engines as well, which is very helpful for us non-engineering types who maybe don't fully understand how a matrix works, and so aren't able to really make full use of coding languages very well. But it is very helpful all around. Python's mostly used for iOS games, but that doesn't make it any less relevant. It is the Mac programming language is Python. I don't know if that's still true. I think it still is. I don't think they've gotten rid of Python quite yet. It's Swift now. Oh, there you go. So I'm gonna have to update this. So yeah, Python now is Swift. It was used for iOS games and for Mac-based operating. That is the reason that most games don't make it to the Mac, is because it uses a completely different coding language for its backend, and so a lot of the calls in C# and C++ don't work on Mac machines. So a lot of games have to be completely rewritten. Ruby is the third-party baby programming language. It's very useful, but it's mostly used for third-party game-making programs like RenPy and RPG Maker. RenPy and RPG Maker both use Ruby. Ruby's very good. It's a very simple programming language, but it is effective. And so I think that there is something there. And then Java. Java's mostly used for online platforms. It's not really super common for heavy lifting. It's still in use. It just isn't very in use for games. So Java programming, especially like JavaScript programming, is sort of the bane of most engineers' existence. If you talk to any engineers about Java, they will tell you the same thing. Java sucks. Don't use it. There's a reason for that. And there's a reason our industry doesn't really interact with Java a terribly large amount. Then we have art. I guess any questions about engineering? Wonderful. All right. Art. Artists are the living soul of any great game. They're very important. They're in charge of making the game beautiful, and artists create the look of the world, right? So without artists, most games would come out looking like BSP, where it would look like a bunch of boxes, maybe with some like rough textures slapped onto them to make them look like less ugly. But needless to say, artists are a critical core component of the games industry, right? If you think about the game making side of the industry as a triangle, it's engineering, design, and art are sort of like the core triangle of the industry, right? We'll get into where production fits into all of this in a little bit, but the three of them really do make up like the core demographic of the industry, right? Artists take the words of designers and make them actually like a tangible thing, right? So if I were to be like, I want our character, he's going to be a small, cute ball with legs and little arms but no fingers, right? An artist is the one that draws up Kirby, right? Your designer and your character designers and your artists for those characters are generally the same person. Normally, you want to have the person designing the character also be the person that draws the character. But you know, there are a lot of situations where it's like, we're going to have a medieval castle. There's going to be a rundown medieval castle filled with spiders. And, you know, there's going to be an indoor moat. And an artist will go, okay, and then, like, make the assets that make that happen, right? Like all the disciplines, they are broken up into very, very distinct artistic categories given the volume of artistic assets in every given game. You'll have things like environmental artists, character artists, texture artists, object artists, UI UX artists, animators, and infinitely more, right? An environmental artist is somebody that makes up the look and geometry of the world. So they'll take that BSP'd out, blocked out space, and they'll actually make it look like something, right? You have to keep in mind that every video game is essentially just a bunch of squares and tubes sort of like stapled together to make playing spaces. Artists are the ones that make it not feel that way. Environmental artists in particular are the ones that make it not feel that way. Character artists are the ones that take the design of a character, like say, you know, he's a rough and tumble biker from the outer reaches who wears a bandana and a leather jacket, and then a character artist will actually sit down and draw out what that character looks like, draw out their move sets, make them come to life rather than just being sort of a description on a page. A texture artist is somebody that makes the 2D assets for a game, so they're the ones that make the wrapping paper for in-game objects. So if you say that you want a chair made out of mahogany, right? An artist might make a chair, like a 3D chair model, and then you might have a texture artist whose job it is to actually create a mahogany chair, right? Or if it's like a book, a texture artist is the one that puts like a cover on the book, right? That kind of a thing. Sometimes texture artists aren't their own department. Sometimes they're rolled into like the object artists department, where like, you know, or like the, you know, if you're making if you're an environmental artist, you might make the texture for whatever environmental piece you're making as well. But sometimes they're their own thing, right? Sometimes it's like, I need you to make me like, here's my object. I need you to make a texture for this that makes it look like it's from a swamp, right? And then a texture artist will do that. Object artists then are the people that make the odds and ends. They're your person that makes like tables, chairs, lamps, light bulbs, oven, dog, like anything that's like not one of the other things we talked about. They're the people that do it. I have a buddy whose entire job is he works at a VR studio. His entire job is he makes like furniture for a living. He is like a 3D artist. He makes furniture for a living, and he works like 8-hour work days, 40 hours a week, just like making chairs in Maya, and that's all he does all day. He says he loves it. Says he probably wouldn't even take a promotion if they offered it to him. They would probably just ask for a pay raise instead, because he just really enjoys sort of like it's kind of soothing to sort of just have your job be make 700 different kinds of table. So, there is a world out there like that. There's UI and UX animators. They're the ones that actually create the HUD elements, right? Again, they work very closely with the designer of that particular element and work from there. And then you have animators. Animators animate things. They're the ones that sort of take character models and character designs, they rig them, and then they animate them to do certain things based on the character artist's like design of it, right? The animation teams are very important, especially in modern game development. But depending on the kind of game, sometimes they get rolled in with the character animators as well, especially if it's 2D. Most 2D games that don't actually require rigging and boning don't actually require a separate animation team for those kinds of characters. Instead, you might have an animator who makes, like, say, the opening cinematics, right? Or somebody that animates, in-game cutscenes or something to that effect, right? There's obviously more artists. It depends a lot on the studio, but this is a pretty decent overview of that, right? In the game world, art's broken up into two major disciplines, right? There's 2D art and 3D art. 2D art is the creation of 2D assets and textures. Generally, they specialize in either pixel art or high-fidelity art, right? 2D is really, really common in independent titles because it's really easy to make. 3D art has a whole bunch of like caveats and skill sets and a bunch of bullshit that's attached to it. And if you're looking to make a game and you don't want to pull your hair out with like animations or with artistic stuff, you want to stick to 2D, right? When we say that you either specialize in pixel art or high fidelity art, those are really the two types of 2D art. Pixel art obviously is square; it invokes a retro style. High fidelity art is all the other kinds of art. And then you can get super high fidelity, which is where you're trying to make a 2D game that looks like a painting, right? So if you've ever seen something like Ori and the Blind Forest, Ori and the Blind Forest is super high fidelity 2D art, right? With high fidelity being somewhere between pixel art like in Celeste and something like Ori and the Blind Forest, where every screen is a work of art, right? 3D art then, conversely, is 3D assets. These are the assets and the skeletons that you use to make a three-dimensional object in a three-dimensional space. The Cecils make 3D assets and pixelate them to be 2D. So that's actually just 3D assets. So although they are rendering them two-dimensionally and you're playing the game two-dimensionally, that's still a 3D artwork, right? So that character is still rigged, it's still boned, it's still animated via 3D animation methods. The 3D art model was probably made in either Maya or Blender, which is its own entirely independent skill set from two-dimensional art, which is normally done in Photoshop or some sort of art asset generation engine, which it could be put into the actual game engine itself, that kind of stuff, right? 3D artists not only create 3D models, but the actual skeleton inside of them. I don't know how much exposure any of you have to like 3D animation, but when you make a 3D model, the reason that you put characters out in a T-pose is because in things like Maya, you need to actually insert bones into the character in order to make them animatable, right? A 3D model by itself is a physical object. Like, you can probably put it into a game and give it like collision, and then people can bump into it and it can do stuff. But in order to actually animate something, it has to have bones. And boning boning a model is difficult, and it requires practice, and it's a whole thing. Rigging the model then and actually attaching the puppet strings to it to allow you to animate it properly is then again its own extra layer forward inside of that animation tunnel, so to speak, right? 3D assets are very, very common in modern games. In fact, most modern games use 3D assets because they're starting to eclipse 2D in ease of use, and because of that, you can really get a lot out of them. But there is still a delineation between the two, and you basically have to pick one or the other to specialize in. People who do both generally are either extremely talented or have a lot of time. And by a lot of time, I mean like experience, right? Both of them require their own distinct set of skills that you sort of have to pick up and learn, and their own set of quirks that you pick up and learn. And I would really recommend, if you're going to become an artist, if that's your goal in your career path, focus on one of these. I would focus on 3D if you plan to work in a studio. I would focus on 2D if you plan to work independently. Any questions about art? Cool. All right, production. My specialty. I love me some production. I see Max is typing, so we'll hold for a hot second to make sure that we don't bulldoze past this question. I got ska music stuck in my head. I was listening to a lot of ska last night. Na na na. This is pretty common for conceptual designers and the art team to get rolled into actual creation of the assets. I've seen some places separate here and there, but like mostly larger studios. Yeah, it's really common. Like I said, when we're talking about all of these delineations, all of these sorts of things, concept artists fall into 2D and they get their own department. Concept is its own rigmarole. So don't worry about concept artists. But as far as like teams rolling into one another, the smaller the studio, the more likely it is that you're going to have your discipline rolled into a different discipline, right? So it's really common, especially in like AA and independent studios, for the person that designs something to also be the person that makes the something, right? It's really likely that you'll end up wearing multiple hats. For instance, if you look at something like Team Meat, Team Meat, which is the studio that makes Super Meat Boy, right? They were originally just Edmund McMillen and Tom Refreeds, right? And then eventually they would add other people to the team. But when they made Super Meat Boy, I believe Super Meat Boy was developed with it was like a 3-person development team. So Edmund McMillen basically made all of the assets, all of the art. He designed the game, made all the art assets, designed all the levels, arted all the levels, and all of that. And then his buddy Tom was the actual one that sat down and built out the systems that made it function properly, right? You'll see this a lot, especially in smaller studios. And I mean, like, basically constantly in smaller studios, right? It's really, really common that you'll end up having to do multidisciplinary stuff. The bigger the studio gets, the more specialized they get, because they want you to be focusing on making one thing very, very well. So, yeah, it's pretty common for conceptual designers and the art team to sort of like get rolled into one another. But like it sort of it expands and contracts the bigger the studio is, right? So yeah. So production, that's my specialty. I know a lot about production. Producers are the project coordinators and time managers of a project. Producers are one of the few key disciplines that is not separated into subspecialties. Instead, producers have a tiered system wherein each level of producer is in charge of a different size of thing, right? An associate producer is in charge of minor projects and day-to-day flow, right? So generally, if you are an associate producer, you might get put in charge of the creation of, like, say, a particular asset. Let's say that it's like a special chair that, like, you could pick up, and when you hit somebody with it, it, like, breaks into pieces, right? An associate producer will be in charge of that chair, right? They might have other things that they're also monitoring, like, say, they have that chair, they have a particular table, they have a texture that they're waiting on, an animation that's being worked on, and, the art for one of the levels, right? An associate producer's job is to monitor the progress of those things and report up the chain to explain if there's any delays, any issues, any resource requirements, anything, or if everything's going hunky-dory, you report that as well, right? The producers are in charge of associate producers, right? So a producer might have 3 or 4 associate producers underneath them that they're monitoring and making sure that they're doing their job and then double checking the work, right? They might also have some larger things that they're focusing on, like say the creation of a character asset, right? Like they might be in charge of monitoring like the progress on Kratos's facial animation rig, right? That's a little bit too heady for an associate producer, but it's something that that a regular producer would probably watch, right? They're also in charge of more macro level things, so they might be in charge of like monitoring the full sprint schedule to make sure everything's happening on time. They might be in charge of coordinating QA efforts. They might be in charge of doing some bigger macro play stuff. A senior producer then has 3 producers underneath them, and a senior producer is in charge of the entirety of the project, the full totality of everything. They also will likely personally monitor things like engine reform or overall like level progress. So like the entirety of like the first world of a game, they might be monitoring the progress of that very readily, right? Getting reports up from associate producers and producers in order to sort of monitor the progress there to make sure that we're having resource allocation issues. A senior producer is also likely a person that is working in coordination with the heads of the studios. So, like, let's say you work at Raven. A senior producer is the person that's coordinating up the chain with Activision about the progress of the game and is having meetings with, like, contractor teams. They're the ones that are likely in charge of, like, figuring out what needs to be hired and fired. They're the ones making final decision making about whether or not a mechanic or an asset is allowed to go into the game. They sort of have their finger in every pie at all times, right? Senior producers generally do a lot less day-to-day project management stuff where they're like doing scheduling or budget allocation, and instead they're working directly with people and sort of working coordinated with what actually needs to get done and who needs to do it and what they need to get that done and that kind of stuff, and then finding the money and finding the resources to do that. Production is very, in my opinion, is the make or break of a project, right? It is one of the very few areas where the decisions that a producer makes have a overarching and sweeping effect across the entire project, right? A good way to think about this is production is the management team of most of a game project, right? And because of that, the decision to say allow the level designers, system designers, and art team to make a zombie horde survival map might be a terrible idea. You're borrowing resources from other areas of the game where they might be better suited, or it might be a great idea and you end up with a franchise development kit that ends up getting you promoted to senior executive, and then you don't have to really worry about money for the rest of your life, right? It's a 50-50 split, and a lot of producers, a lot of project managers they're the ones that are telling people like, no, the game needs to come out like next week because we're out of money, right? Or, okay, we can delay the game, but like I'm gonna have to fire like 10 people, right? And that's the kind of the reality of production. It's very spooky. There's not very many producers per team. You'll probably have 1 producer for every 10 people, right? So if you have a 500-person team, you're probably going to have like 50 producers that are broken up into these categories. But that's not that many people, right? It just isn't. And so it can be kind of scary. And there is a cap to the number of producers that most studios will hire. Normally, you don't have more than 20 producers on a team at any given time. There's just not a need for that many people to do project management. But you'll find that production people are very... they're removed from the development team, but they're also the most involved of all of the developers, right? Producers have their hands in pretty much every aspect of a game, and so are expected to sort of have a basic high-level understanding of every aspect of a game, which is why I have a basic high-level understanding of every single aspect of game development, right? It's because as a producer, it's my job to sort of be able to tell an artist, like, I need you to be able to animate this thing, and I need it rigged faster, I need to have more in-betweens for this thing, I need this to be a smoothed out animation frame, please, that kind of stuff, right? I don't have any idea how to do any of that, but I know what the hell I'm talking about. And if an animator was like, well, we can't do that because we have to tween it with this animation engine, I'd be like, tweening is only for Flash animation. Don't fucking screw with me. Like, just fix it, right? Like, that kind of stuff. Timelines are a very critical component of any project, right? But especially in games, coordinating efforts, resources, and timing for all project is step one to making sure that a game releases on time. Production is the first one in and the last one out for any projects. This makes them the most stable career path, but also the hardest to enter. Generally speaking, producers are hired from within, right? If you're going to have a producer on your team, you're going to hire somebody that's been working with that team for long enough to have a decent understanding of how everybody works and the timelines that you can expect out of somebody. That being said, if you are a producer, producers get paid the most out of all of the disciplines, and they are the least likely to get fired in the event of a studio downsizing, right? And if you do get fired and you do get downsized out, it's very likely that you'll get snapped up by a different studio, because getting people with AAA experience or getting people with extensive inner working experience, highly profitable in the production space, right? Producers are hired internally, and it can make it kind of difficult to get into, but it is the most stable career path. Engineers have the highest ability. We'll talk a little bit about money at the end here, but for now, just understand that production is probably, like, if you're going to try to make a career out of something, production is probably where you're going to end up eventually. But we'll talk a little bit about money in a little bit here. Audio. The audio team, the audio engineers and designers are sort of a duality of creating sound for the world, right? Although sometimes they're neglected and rolled into the design or the art team, audio is a very critical part of any game. Audio teams are a crossroads between design, engineering, and art, and they require very specific skills to achieve what it is that they need to be able to do, right? If you've ever worked with anything audio related, it's kind of like a matzo ball of, like, weirdness. And it can be sometimes kind of difficult to understand and move forward with that kind of work, right? Audio is the only dimension of gameplay that I have literally no experience with. I'm tone deaf, so I don't know how to make music. And I also have a very difficult time wrapping my brain around sound and physicality when I'm trying to make stuff. So I've, like, very rarely worked with audio engineering at all. I've been an engineer, which is how I know that I'm a bad engineer. But I took one audio class in college, and I've never worked with it since. It's basically broken up into two categories. The sound effects composition, which is you make the sound effects for a game, which is like, if I punch somebody, what noise does it make when the character's fist connects with the other character's head, right? And then there's musical composition, which is creating musical scores. Your Halo soundtracks and your Marty O'Donnells of the world, right? Both of these are pretty self-explanatory. They have different skill sets. Composition obviously requires you to have some sort of musical background. Sound effects, any monkey can do sound effects, but there is a certain art to doing things like Foley and stuff of that nature, so keep that in mind. And then you get QA. QA is sort of the sixth arm of the game development cycle. QA teams are responsible for finding, documenting, and reporting bugs and issues to the development team to make sure that the product is working in a way that makes it functional, right? Generally, QA requires the least amount of effort to get started on. Any of you could go be a QA tester tomorrow if you really needed to. It is not a difficult job to do. However, there is a difference between an okay QA tester and a great QA tester. And that difference is the difference between being a QA lead and a QA tester, right? QA is a very deep rabbit hole. It has its entirely own, like, how to put this? If making a video game is like building a house, QA is the garage, right? It's its own building that you attach to the side of the house, and it has its own internal structure, its own promotional path, its own route to success, and everything in between, right? QA teams are great, and I have my buddy Riley works at Epic Games. He's one of the QA analysts for Fortnite right now. He makes tremendous money a year. I think he said he was pulling in like 70 a year right now, working as a QA analyst. QA analysts are different than QA testers. They're the next step up, right? So a good way to think about this is like, if a QA lead, actually let's just open up Paint.net here, because it'll be easier to draw this out for all of you. Because it's not on the slide, because I only learned about this really recently, and by really recently I mean like I learned about it like last week, and just forgot to put it on the paint on this thing. So if we have like the QA development team, right, is down here, right? It's the QA team, right? Your QA team is made up of testers, right? Testers, oh my god. Testers and leads, right? This is ugly shit, right? Your QA team is down here, right? They're the ones that you give a copy of the game to, right? And then they create a thing, right? Then you get up here in this much cleaner box, because I remembered that I could just make that, and we're also going to remember it. You have your analysts, you have your test makers. I mean, listen, you're absolutely right. You have your analysts, your test makers, and you have your senior QA devs, right? Your QA team are the team that are in the weeds doing the grunt work, right? So if I need you to go into level 2 and figure out if there are any script breaks, right? And that's your QA job for that day. Your job is to boot up the level in the build of the game that I gave you, run through level 2, and see if you can break any of the scripts, right? The way you determine what the QA teams do is a QA analyst works with the test makers to see what areas of the game require the most focus based on the development team's current schedule of work. It is a very involved process that is very difficult and is the make or break between a game releasing with very few bugs and a game releasing with tons of bugs. Test makers are also engineers who make tools that you then use to automate testing in order to test large swaths of the game without human interference, right? Most human testers are going to be sent to try to do things like script breaking, looking for things like, if I beat this level too quickly, does it cause the game to arrest, right? Or if I throw a grenade in this corner, it causes the game to crash every single time, right? Or I boot up the game, I move 2 feet to the right and pick up this gun and it causes the Xbox to explode, right? That's the kind of thing that a human tester is going to be looking for. A machine tester is going to be doing things like looking over all of the weaponry in the game to make sure that it's doing the proper amount of damage, right? A machine tester is going to look over the game and double check for things like, does the right audio file launch when that kind of stuff, right? Yeah, right? Honestly, it sounds like it takes very little to make an Xbox explode. I mean, it doesn't take very much. They have very bad heating pads. But yeah. You want to, if you're going to get into bug testing, you also need to have a comprehension of things like, how does the game's engine work, right? How does things like, obviously, we're talking about having a basic understanding of the inner Guttle workings. So it is helpful to have a core understanding of game design and game development before you become a QA tester, but it's not necessary. I was a QA tester at 18. I worked on Modern Warfare 3 and the Skylanders games at Activision before I went to college. I had zero experience in game development outside of working on some stuff with like the Warcraft 3 map making engine. I got paid like $15 an hour back in like 2005. So I was making like fucking crazy money back in 2005. QA is a great job. It's a lot of fun. If you have a summer and you can work as a QA tester, try to make it happen. If you happen to live near somewhere where they're hiring QA devs, make it happen. Your guys are in school. It's not that hard to get into one of these jobs. See if you can make it happen. If you can't, not a big deal. But it is a fun job to try to get into. All right. Some data. These are the breakdowns for the average starting salary for a lot of these jobs, right? Associate producers make between $40,000 and $50,000 a year. That can go up to $60,000 depending on what the delineation between production levels in the studio is. Some studios do not have a middle level producer, so if there's just an associate and a senior, the associates make a little bit more because of that. Senior producers make between $75,000 and $85,000 a year. A lot of these statistics are taken off of Indeed, if you're wondering where I got these numbers from. Technical artists are making somewhere between $55,000 and $65,000 a year. Software engineers between $60,000 and $70,000. Game designers between $45,000 and $55,000. Creative directors between $55,000 and $65,000. Quality assurance people make between $15 and $20 an hour with benefits. You will generally be working full time, and they will sometimes make you work overtime. Overtime in the games industry is 2 times, so you end up making double time basically, which is really, really helpful. A QA lead makes between $40,000 and $50,000 a year. Audio engineers are between $65,000 and $75,000 a year. Lead designers are between $75,000 and $85,000. A senior programmer makes between $85,000 and $95,000, and a development lead is between $80,000 and $90,000 a year. These are general averages. There are outliers that go higher and outliers that go lower than some of these little breakdowns, right? But as you can kind of see, programming is the way to make money. If your goal is to become like a fucking fat cat and make a bunch of money, you want to get into programming. Programming is the easiest job to get into. It pays the best and is the easiest to shift around in and end up moving up the ladder. The problem is that it is the most difficult job from a labor perspective, right? So if you are a programmer, you're going to be expected to do a shitload of work all the time, and that work is difficult, and so you get paid decently because of that, right? QA bills per hour, could that be the reason why games are released broken because they can't afford the QA at the end anymore? Absolutely. A lot of studios skimp on the QA because a lot of studios do not actually appreciate the value of quality QA personnel. Most QA personnel are hired out via QA contracting houses. So if you want to, say, be a quality assurance tester, it's very unlikely that you'll get hired directly as a QA tester. Instead, what you'll probably end up doing is finding a QA house that will hire you out as a contracted employee to a studio, and then that studio will pay you per hour, essentially. There are embedded QA positions, embedded testing positions, and those people get paid on a salary basis, right? So you might get paid $35 to $40 a year to be an embedded QA tester, but your job is to basically you live in the studio with the rest of the development team, and then they make you do like important ad hoc work instead of sort of like the generalized QA testing. You might be expected to understand software engineering testing procedures and then sort of like do that kind of stuff. You'll be expected to have things like an ISTQB testing certification and a bunch of other things like that. But yeah, generally speaking, it's because QA is billed per hour, it can get really expensive. And so a lot of studios skimp on it because they use a lot of that money for development time, which is a mistake. It is an absolute mistake. It causes a lot more problems than it solves, and a lot of studios should just cut down on the scale of a game in order to make room for QA. But what do I know? I'm just the guy that does nothing but academic study of the industry for 30 hours a week every week. So any questions about game development, the game development teams, or anything that we talked about today? I see several people typing. This is good. I like it when people have questions. It shows you guys actually have a passion for what we're talking about. It's very heartening. Kind of on topic, but can we expect grades on our submissions? Oh yeah, that reminds me. Thank you for bringing that up, Ryan. I'm just super fucking behind right now, so I do apologize. I'm going to try to get them graded this week. So I expect to have grades this week. Because I'm very behind, do expect that I will not be typing up direct feedback on most things. But do know that I actually have read through most of the things you guys have turned in, and they're all really, really well done. So I wanted to actually congratulate all of you on that. This is the first semester where I've actually wanted to read through everything. I always read through everything, but it's the first semester where it hasn't felt like I wanted to neck myself halfway through them. You guys have had some very interesting topics and some very interesting things that you have covered, and I really do appreciate that you guys have worked very hard on it. So I am reading them. I just haven't. I'm just very behind right now. So I do apologize for that. They should. I'm hoping to have them all be caught up on grading this week, because I don't actually have any assignments for my grad classes due this week. So I actually have time. What would you happen to know what a portfolio should look like for an art team member, or where one might poke around to see one? Well, you were in luck, because portfolios, game art portfolios are something that you can 100% just Google and people will have them show up for you. I actually do recommend Claire Hummel's, Gavin's, and Greg Fort's are the three that I normally use. All of them use ArtStation. ArtStation is becoming sort of like the place for art portfolios. And so, I mean, you laugh, but like, this is an art portfolio, right? Like, you click on Blade, and he's done his art. He's got his art director from Insomniac. He does a lot of work. He's drawing out a bunch of stuff. I mean, he's worked on suit concepts for Miles Morales, all that kind of stuff. It's really not that difficult to find art portfolios, keeping in mind that things like, you want to make sure that you're showing off all of your artwork, but you want to make sure you're showing off your best stuff, right? So if you have something that's like kind of uggo, maybe don't throw it up on your portfolio unless there's a particular reason you're throwing it up on your portfolio. Nobody gives a shit about the progress you've made, so don't do that either, right? But ArtStation's very big for portfolios. A lot of people throw up all of their 2D art onto ArtStation, right? If you're, in particular, just like pull up some stuff. Moby Frax is broken. Oh no, Moby, did you forget to pay your bill? Obviously, actually, Brent Johnson's a friend of mine, but he's got his portfolio somewhere on here, on his LinkedIn page. I just don't remember where. But yeah, Wyatt's a good friend of mine. Actually, he and I met. I should have had him on LinkedIn, but I'll worry about that later. You guys don't get to see all my LinkedIn messages. But there's a lot of stuff that you can kind of pull out and kind of take a look at. So you can just Google it, right? And there's plenty to find. Daniel says, I used to do QA in Poland for Mortal Kombat, and a lot of it is outsourced. Like my company, QLock, tested games like Overwatch, Doom. Yeah, the majority of QA is outsourced. You end up hiring a company and giving them a budget, and then you get paid hourly out of that budget, which is why a lot of QA people, they get like, you're not supposed to have like overtime a lot of the time. So like, because there's like a strict budget for QA. But yeah, if you end up wanting to work in QA, you'll probably end up working for like a QA testing contract company, and then you'll get sent places. If you've ever watched, they're dead now, but there was the Two Best Friends play on YouTube, a great YouTube channel that is now deceased because they're not friends anymore. They were all QA testers. Matt and Wooly were both QA testers, and Matt used to talk about how he worked for a QA testing house that used to just send him all over Canada. So he would like live somewhere for like a year, right? And then his contract would end, and the contracting company he worked for would just send him somewhere else. And so he would then move and like live somewhere else for a year, and then his contract would end. And then sometimes they would re-up it, and so then he could live somewhere for like a couple of years, and then his contract would end and they would send him somewhere else. So like that happened constantly to him. Outsourcing work is difficult, but like it's fun. It's not a terribly difficult job. It's pretty enjoyable, but it is a lot of work, and it can be kind of taxing from like a labor standpoint. Roughly how many words are you looking for in your submissions? Like my brain juice occasionally runs out at like 600. I don't really care how long they are, as long as you cover the topic. I give you guys the 2-page minimum to stop people from doing like a half a page. I like I said, that's the reason I read everything, is because if you cover the topic and I feel like you actually took the time to sit and reflect and think about it, I'm not going to punish you if you're like light on something, especially if I can tell like you just ran out of juice on the topic. Like that's fine. I don't sweat the length so much. Just keep writing until you feel like you've covered the topic. But at minimum, I expect at least a page and a half, right? Everything we talk about, if you even do a mild amount of critical thinking, critical analysis, you should be able to get to a page and a half. I could get to a page and a half on a lot of these topics, and I have written these papers like seven to 800 times, and I would still have new things to talk about. So, I mean, you guys got to work with me a little bit, right? For Max, yeah, sometimes people do have dedicated portfolios for the website for art teams. A lot of people have been moving towards ArtStation. Most people don't really give a shit about how your portfolio works as long as it shows off your work. What they care about is how does the work look, right? They want to see that you can do the job, that you can actually manage it, that kind of stuff. So keep that in mind. It's less important what you make as what's on the thing that you make, right? So if you want to have your own website, go for it. But most people just use ArtStation, from my understanding. That's become sort of like the vogue thing to do right now. Cool. Any other questions? Any other concerns? Anything else that people are curious about or anything like that? Awesome. Cool. So for this week, you guys are going to go job hunting. I want you guys to go onto that website, Grackle HQ. Okay. I want you to find a job that you are interested in, look at the job posting, and then work out what it is that you need to learn, what you still need to learn, what skills you already have, and if there's anything surprising about the job posting that you weren't expecting, right? I really want you guys to take some time and analyze, like, for myself, right? So we'll do this live without writing it down in person here, right? So I'm a production person, so I'm gonna go to production, and let's pick. Probably shouldn't go to the one in Spain because I don't speak Spanish. Let's go with producer at High Res Studio. That's a good one, right? So for myself, right, this is the job posting for the producer job at High Res Studio, right? What do our producers do? Work with leadership to identify the key priorities and support the game team, coordinate development and deliverables for your team, and support required interactions across the team. Manage multiple backlogs for your team, ensuring that they are working on the proper item in the priority order. Active solution seeker, always looking for ways to solve problems and improve process. Identify risks and roadblocks to hitting dates and coordinating with teams. And find a way to mitigate risks. Ability to follow instructions. Ability to understand requirements and ensure that they are met. Provide regular updates on the team. What we're looking for: a college degree with 3 or more years of game industry production experience, which I have. Strong time management skills, which I have and I don't have. It really depends on like how many directions I'm getting pulled in. Ability to multitask, absolutely have that. Knowledge of Microsoft Office, of Atlassian Suite, and ShotGrid. I don't know what the hell ShotGrid is, so I would then Google ShotGrid, right? Project management software owned by Autodesk, so it's Autodesk's weird project management tool. It looks like they mostly use Gantt charts from the look of it. Yeah, it looks like it's progress bar based, something like that. Yeah, it looks like it's just a team management, project management tool. I have experience with something similar to this called Airtable. That's what I normally use, and obviously Microsoft Teams, Microsoft Project, that kind of stuff. Web-based digital media content experience a plus. I have that. I make digital media content actively currently, and I also produce things for a YouTube website, right? A team player who's flexible, adaptive, and seems like a problem solver. That I think that describes me, but that's an interesting thing that's what they'd be looking for, right? Maintain a positive and proactive work ethic. Absolutely have that. I'm a captain optimism at the workplace. Eagerly tackle new projects and challenges in pursuit of career growth. I mean, I'm literally going back to my master's program specifically to do this, right? Strong communication skills. I teach you guys for a living. I feel like my communication skills are pretty good. Self-motivated. I have a problem with this. I'm not self-motivated. It's actually like it's a quality flaw of myself. I have a huge problem with self-motivation. I'm getting better at it. It's something that I've been working on over the years, but I have trouble with that. Familiarity with content pipelines. I do have familiarity with content pipelines, but what you should do in the situations where it's a nice to have is actually refamiliarize yourself with whatever it is that they're looking for. And then experience working with contractors and vendors. I actually have this from working at Cloud9, right? So this actually seems like a job that I could apply for right now if I felt like it, right? For a lot of you, you're going to have things like, the 3 years of development experience that you don't have, right? Because I have 3 years of development experience, right? So that might be something that you might want to try to work on. Maybe, say, making summer projects or doing it while you're here in your associate's program and working on some college level work, right? Some of you might not have a knowledge of like the various tools and assets that they're asking you to do. So that might be something that you look into and say, they asked for Talesian suites, and I've never heard of a Talesian suites, right? So then I Googled the Talesian suites, and now I'm kind of taking a look at it. It's actually Confluence, by the way, which I have experience with, which is why I know what a Talesian suites is. It's a fucking weird word to say, but it's a Talesian suites. All of that kind of stuff, right? So maybe that's something you can learn up and pick up and work on, right? So what I want you all to do is, and I'll type this into, we're going to turn homework help into homework tasks. There you go. Congratulations. No more help. You guys get no help. You just get tasks now. This week, I want all of you to go to Grackle HQ and find a job that you would like to apply for at some point in the future, right? Does not have to be right now. Read the job post. Sorry, I'm typing it while I'm like talking. Read the job post and tell me about the following. What does the job entail? Where is it? What skills are they looking for? What skills or information do you need to obtain? Is there anything that surprised you, right? I'm not going to put a limit. Like, there's no size ask on this one. I don't care how long this is. This is for your benefit, right? The more often that you're looking at jobs, right, the more likely it's going to be that you're going to be able to actually like discernibly understand the direction and the work that you need to put in to get to where you need to go in your life, right? I did not look at job postings while I was in college, right? I didn't bother doing it. So you have to get going? Oh, no problem, Jeffrey. Have a good one. Be safe. I did not look at job postings while I was in school. And so I did not know the skill sets that I needed to be working on while I was working on stuff. Your benefit of having me as your professor is that I get to tell you, hey, go do this, right? This will be very helpful for you. So use this opportunity to really take a look at these things, take an opportunity to sort of like have a decent understanding of the job that you're trying to go for, and angle yourself like that, right? If you want to be an artist and they want you to have experience making 3D animated rigged models in Maya, you had better start learning how to make 3D animated and rigged models in Maya, right? It's just a thing that you gotta have to do, right? So that's your assignment for next week. Hopefully this will be a rewarding process for all of you, and that is all I have for all of you today. So I will see you all next week.